Hey everyone, welcome to this tutorial series. This is Intro to Game VFX in Unreal Engine's Niagara editor. We have designed this tutorial series so that hopefully there will be something good for everyone. So if you have never made an effect before anywhere, then we are going to be starting from the ground up. We're going to be starting super simple with our cute little fire here, and we are going to be building up into more of the technical details and the different tools that Niagara offers after that. Niagara is incredibly powerful, and we want to make it super approachable and get you comfortable and just having fun making effects in it. And then after that, we are going to be diving into some of the artistic and gameplay fundamentals that will help you make awesome effects no matter what engine you're in or what tools you're using. So I am super glad you're here. I am going to go through the three major building blocks that Niagara uses, just for anyone who has never used Niagara before. And then we will make our little fire buddy here from scratch. So let's get going. As mentioned, there are three major kind of layers that make up a Niagara system. The top layer is the system itself. That is this whole thing. It is what puts everything together to make our fire here. If we click on the browse button here to jump back to the content browser, you can see our file down here. We can drag this into the world, and we've got a second little fire. So the system's main job is to be a home for all of these smaller pieces that combine to make our fire, or an explosion, or anything else. Now, as far as those pieces, the major ones are emitters. Each of these three brown boxes is a single emitter, and what an emitter does is it takes a relatively consistent set of behaviors and applies those to particles. So if we isolate our flames by clicking this little lonely dude up here, you can see there's some randomness in this. There's randomness in the rotation, there's randomness in exactly where they move or how long they're on screen for, or stuff like that. But by and large, these are using the same colors. They're sticking around for about the same amount of time and staying in a relatively confined space. If we go over to our embers by comparison, you can see there are a lot of things in common between these two. They're using the same colors, they're using that same base little square texture, stuff like that. But these ones are consistently a much smaller size range. They are consistently moving in this swirling pattern, stuff like that. And those sorts of very consistent differences are the sorts of things that make it worth creating a new emitter, as opposed to just adding more randomness or stuff like that into our first flame emitter. And finally, we will jump over to our last emitter, our smoke. Obviously, again, there are a fair number of similarities, a fair number of differences, and this is where I want to talk about our third layer of a Niagara effect, which is modules. So modules are the super simple little sets of traits or instructions that all add up to create the behavior and particles of an emitter. So if we go through some of the different modules in our smoke emitter, for example, the spawn rate module just controls how quickly new particles are created by the emitter. So if we disable it by checking this box over here, we just stop getting particles because we've stopped telling it to create particles. Jump down to our shape location here, and if we disable this, then it goes back down to where particles originate by default, at the scene origin as opposed to where this location module is telling it to spawn, slightly higher up, a little bit more randomly. And for one final example, if we jump down to our scale color module here, if we disable this, then the particles stop changing color or transparency over their lifetime because we have taken away this gradient that was telling them what to do, how to do it. So those are the 3 major building blocks to a Niagara effect. We are going to be jumping into these a lot more as we build this effect from scratch, but hopefully just having that base language to start with is helpful. So now let's make our fire. So to start, we're just gonna drag our existing friend off to the side here. So I am just down in the content browser here. I'm going to just right click anywhere in the empty space. And you can see the Niagara system is right up here. It's also down in effects down here if you need that. But we're just going to go ahead and click this. We're going to create an empty system so that we can go through all of the steps of creating this. We'll hit finish. We will give this a name, demo. We'll go ahead and double click that to open it to start editing it. We'll just drag it up here and whoop, dock it, and we're ready to go. First thing that's probably really obvious here, there's nothing actually happening in here yet because we don't actually have any emitters to tell it to do anything or to add any particles. So we're going to go ahead and just anywhere in the empty space, we're going to right click, add emitter, and we're going to add a fountain emitter because this has a lot of the modules that we're going to be using to create this. I'm just going to go ahead and rename this real quick. So we'll do an E for Niagara emitter, and this one will be our flames. And I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of a couple of modules that we're not going to be using yet. So we will get rid of our gravity force. I've just highlighted it and I'm going to hit the delete key. The gravity is very clearly gone. And then we'll get rid of our drag. And from here, we can just start editing. So to start with, we're just going to go up to the spawn rate, and I'm going to set this a lot lower. I'm going to set it to something like 25. And that's all we need to do there. Now, if we jump down one to initialize particle, this is one of the bread and butter modules. And this one actually gives a lot more instructions than these normally do. This one is going to give usually all of the super basic info that your particle needs. So it's going to tell it how long to live. It's going to tell it what colors it's going to start at, what size, stuff like that. So for starters, we're just going to add a little bit more randomness to the minimum and maximum lifetimes here. For these sorts of random pairs in Niagara, you're gonna give it a minimum, you're gonna give it a maximum, and it will pick randomly somewhere between those two. So we'll have some particles that last 1 second, some that last 2, some that last 1.357. And that's all we need to do there. In the color, we're just going to left click on the color swatch real quick. We're going to make this some nice little kind of orangey color. Seems good. The mass mode stuff you can actually ignore for now. It's really useful for very physically accurate particles if you are going to be dealing a ton with like gravity and forces and stuff like that. But we don't really need this for this one. This is pretty simple. It's pretty stylized. So you can either ignore it or if you ever want to reset a value on any module to its default, you can click this little U-turn over here, and that will reset it to whatever its default is. And then the last thing that we're going to look at in here is just our sprite size. We're going to go ahead and set those to be a little bit bigger, so we'll do like 25 and 40. And that's everything that we need to do in here. It's just those three. Now a couple of kind of scene or hygiene or whatever you want to call it notes that are probably worth calling out at this point. You can see probably, even though I'm using a very similar color in both of these, this one is very bright. And that's because sometimes Niagara's preview window doesn't entirely agree with what the actual scene looks like. So these are getting super blown out right now. And the way we fix that is pretty easy. We just go up to this little lit drop down up here. We're gonna uncheck auto in the exposure, and we're going to, in the case of this one, we're gonna set our EV to 0. But whatever you need to make this accurate to what you're seeing in your scene, you can just adjust it to that. And they're working on fixing this in future versions of Unreal, so hopefully by the time you see this, this part will be completely irrelevant. A few other things while we're in here. If we go up to the window tab while we're in Niagara, it'll be different if you're over here. But while we're in a Niagara file, we hit window and we go to preview scene settings. You might have an environment like this or something, and you can disable that just by hitting show environment. You can also give yourself a little floor if you want. All of those are fine to work in. I like working in the gray box for really simple stuff, and just checking that what I'm doing looks right in the scene. But whichever of those settings you like most, preview scene settings is where you adjust them. And finally, let's just bounce down to Sprite Renderer. Sprite Renderer is another of the modules that you're going to be interacting with a lot, but especially early on, in a very simple way. There's a ton of stuff in here, and the only thing you need to worry about is this very first line with the material. Because we're going to go ahead and switch this to a square material real quick, just so that you can actually see these particles rotating. So if we go ahead and hit the little folder magnifying glass, that'll bounce us over to our default sprite material, and we're just going to Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste, and now we've got that down here. And let's rename that to Particle Square Demo, and we'll just double click again to open that. Now, there's a bunch of stuff in here that we don't actually need yet, so we can go ahead and drag to select and delete everything except our particle color. And our particle color, we can just drag the very top pin. This is RGB combined as opposed to, each of the individual pins down here. We can drag that into emissive color, and then we can drag this gray bottom pin. I'm just left click, drag, and then plugging it in over here. And that alpha channel will go into our opacity. And now if I click off of this so I don't have anything selected, then you can see some of the reasons why I duplicated this from another particle instead of just creating it from scratch. This just gives us a couple of extra settings already set that we want over here. So our shading mode, for instance, is unlit, which is really common for a lot of particles. And so the only thing that we need to change over here is we're just going to change our blend mode from additive, which just means it adds more and more light and gets really, really bright really fast. We're going to change that to translucent, which is just going to give us particles that draw on top of each other without adding more light instead. So we can go ahead and hit save, browse back to it. Since we've already got it selected in the content browser, when we go back to our torch, we can just hit this little arrow here and it will automatically add it. But you can also just click on the drop down here and you can search for any material that you want and apply it that way. Oop. All right, so that's kind of everything in terms of housekeeping in this. So let's go ahead and wrap our flames up. Our next module that we're going to be digging into is the shape location. And this is just going to let us customize exactly where particles initially spawn. If you don't have anything as far as location, then they will always spawn at the origin of the scene. And what this shape location is doing is, in this case, it's creating a sphere that particles can spawn randomly anywhere within. So it gives you a little bit more volume and we can create a little bit more of a campfire shape or whatever we need with that. So we're going to go ahead and just make the radius a little bit smaller, something like 5, and go ahead and double check everything looks good in our transforms. So that's all we actually need to do for this one. And then next up in our add velocity module down below that, so we are just going to switch this from a cone, which is what's giving us this kind of cone-shaped movement. We're going to switch that to linear, and linear is kind of like it sounds like. It's very, very simple motion. It's just taking in instructions for how fast to move in X, Y, and Z and applying that to the particles. So right now this has a velocity of 50 on Z, and that's it. So they're just moving straight up. If I add, say, 50 on X as well, they start moving in a diagonal. Let's go ahead and add something silly like 100 on Y. They start running away a little bit as well. Now we only need the Z motion, so this is actually pretty good. But since this is a fire and we want a little bit more of that randomness and organicness, we're going to add some randomness into this. So if we click this little arrow next to here, then we're going to search random range, and this is going to give us a couple different options, but the one that we want is this random range vector. And that's going to, just like the lifetimes and the size that we were looking at up in initialized particle, this is going to let us input a minimum, say 50, and a maximum 75, and it'll randomly pick between those. So this will give us just a little bit more variation, which is nice for a fire. And that's the last thing in particle spawn. So all of our initial values are taken care of. We've got our spawn rate all set up. We've got our little square material hooked up. And all that's left is to jump down into particle update and tell these particles how to change over the course of their lifetime. So there are generally going to be 2 in here that again, like initialized particle, like sprite render or spawn rate, they're kind of bread and butter, but you can actually usually ignore them. The first one is particle state, which just tells particles to actually die off after their lifetime ends and get removed from the scene. The second one is this solve forces and velocity, and all this is doing is anytime that you're adding velocity or force or anything like that, this just tells it to run all the calculations and actually apply it to the particles and get them moving. So those two will usually exist in your particle update, and most of the time you can ignore them. So just know they're there. But for our spawn color, that is going to be the first one that we're going to start playing around with here. And we are going to switch that in the scale mode up here. We're going to jump down to the color curve. The curves like you're seeing here can be really, really nice because you can, add keys and you can add keys. You can adjust the tangents of those keys to get like really, really fine-tuned animation. We'll dig into this a lot more in the next tutorial. But the color curve is really, really nice and user-friendly. It's very handy if you're super visual. And if you don't need really, really fine-tuned control, then it's just kind of a lot more intuitive and easy for a lot of people. A couple things we're going to be adding in here. First off, we're going to go to our very first key here. We're just going to double click it. And we're going to make this kind of a nice light yellow. And the other thing we're going to do here is we're going to go down to the value down here, V, and we're going to set this to like 4. And what this does is it will actually push the particle beyond the brightest value of 1. And once you do that, then it starts glowing, which is really, really nice for fire or magic or a lot of other things. So we're going to go ahead and start there, and we're also going to just drag it in a little bit so the particles stay bright and yellow for a little bit longer. And then for our last key over here, we're just going to select that. Again, double click it to pull up the color picker, and we're just going to make this a good old-fashioned pure red. And because we've got the transparency fading it out at the end, we'll just drag drag this in a little bit as well. And finally, for our last key, we're just going to left click anywhere up here in the color section. That'll add a new key. And then we can double click that one. And we will set this to a nice little orange. And then we're just going to set this to we're going to set the value to something like 1.5 so it has a little bit of glow. So that's all of our color instructions. And then down along the bottom of the curve here, we've got our alpha keys. So we like having this 0 transparency key at the end here because that's what's letting them fade out. But we want to keep them fully transparent for a little bit longer. So we're going to go ahead and drag this first 100% opacity key just a little bit past our orange. We will add a second full opacity key right where our yellow starts. And then just to stop them from doing this little pop appearance down at the base, we're going to left click down there, add one last key, and we can just right click on this, and that'll give us both the opacity, which we can set to 0, and it also gives us the time. So if we wanted this to be a lot later, we could set it to like 0.7. You can adjust any of these keys manually and really precisely by right-clicking on them if you want to, or you can just drag and drop. It's up to you. But that's everything for our color. So next we are going to start adding some new modules since we have run out of modules to edit. So to add a new module, I'm just gonna left click on this little plus circle to the side of the section of the emitter that I'm in. And in this case, what we want to do next is we want to change the size of our particles over their lifetimes. So I'm going to go ahead and hit scale, size. You can see we get a couple options down here in the size section, and we want to scale sprite size because we are, per the renderer down here, we're working with sprites. This one's already given us a curve, so we're just going to modify the keys in this curve. This is probably very familiar to anyone who has worked in animation before or anything like that. We're just going to set up our keyframes to create the curve of the sprite scale that we want over its lifetime. So we can just drag and select this first key, and we'll set the, we can leave the time at 0, but we're going to set the scale to, say, 0.75. We'll go ahead and adjust this last key really quickly. The time being at 1 is good. That's exactly what we want. But for the size, we'll put it at something a little smaller, like 0.4. So this gets us a little bit of a taper, which is nice, but I still want a little bit more organicness out of this. So we're going to go ahead and just right-click, again, anywhere in the empty canvas, as is usual with Unreal, and we're going to hit Add Key. And we'll go ahead and do that one more time over here. And then for both of these, we're just going to drag select both of them at the same time, and we'll set the size of both of them to 1. Then we're going to select just one at a time, and we're going to set the time of this first key to 1 and the time of this second key to like 0.25. And you can see this starts to give us a little bit of a burst in the size before it tapers back down, which is kind of nice for a fire in particular. The last thing that we're going to do here is we're just going to drag and select all of these, and we're going to right-click on the keys. And what that will do is it brings up a bunch of tangent options. So if I go ahead and hit Auto here, then you can see it reveals all of these little curves. Again, probably super familiar to anyone who's worked with animation before. But if I just select one key so that I have access to the little handles here, these let me adjust the tangent curve of the transitions between these different keys. So this is already pretty much all we wanted. Like, we just wanted to smooth this out a little bit so it's not quite so stair-steppy. But we can go ahead and like smooth this out just a little bit. And that's all you need out of the sprite size. Something just to know in the back of your head with these update modules that say scale, these are just multiplying on top of whatever size or color or stuff like that you gave the particle in particle spawn. So in the case of our scale mode, where we started with something between 25 and 40, this is going to multiply on top of that. So if our particle started with a scale of 25, then at its biggest here, it's going to be just over 25 because this curve jumps a little bit over, but it'll start at like 18-ish and it'll end at like, 12 or 10 or what have you. That's that's more math than you really need to think about it in, but that's what's going on here, is this curve is just constantly multiplying the initial size of the particle. Same for color, etc. So the last thing that we're going to do for this emitter is we're just going to add a little bit of rotation over the course of the particle's lifetimes as well. So we're going to go ahead and again click the little plus sign, and we're just going to type sprite rotation, and we're going to select the sprite rotation rate. Now we've already got our initial rotation set up here in the sprite attributes in our initialized particle, and that's just set to random right now. So it's just picking anything between 0 degrees and 360 degrees, and each particle gets that. This one, we just want to add a little bit more rotation over the course of each particle's lifetime to give it one more little bit of organicness. So for our sprite rotation rate up here, we're just going to, again, go over to this little drop-down arrow over here. I'm going to type for a random range again, and we'll just go between -30 and 30. So this is going to be subtle, but you can see compared to if we disable it, you get a nice little bit of kind of the rotating or curling motion that you would see out of a flame without it feeling like jarring or hitting too much of extremes. And that's going to be it for our flame emitter for right now. So we're going to go ahead and drag and select this, and then Control-C, Control-V to create a new one. And we're going to use this as the base for our embers now. So I'll just rename this real quick before anything else. Any embers. And a lot of our values here are going to be the same across modules. So we'll just go through and do a few little tweaks real quick. We're going to set our spawn rate a little bit lower. Actually, let's go ahead and isolate this real quick so we can see the differences a little more readily. In our initialized particle, we're just going to make these hang out a little bit longer. And one of the other big things we're going to do here in our color, we're going to make them brighter in general, just so that, we want these to be our like bright little extra sparks. So we're going to default them to be more yellow than orange in general, but we're also going to revisit those little glowy value cheats of pushing value past 1. So we're going to set our initial value to 2 here. And if we unisolate real quick, you can see how much of a difference that's starting to make. Since these are drawing behind the flames right now, we're going to do one more quick little visit down to Sprite Renderer. So material is the main one that you need to interact with, but if you go all the way to the opposite end, way down at the bottom, there's this section called sort order with sort order hint. And this is really nice for like if you need to force the sorting of some particles in a particular way, then you can do that here just by moving this number up higher than the one behind it. If we go back to flames and we set this to 2, then it draws back in front, so we'll leave that at 0. But if something's ever not drawing or stacking in quite the way you want it to, then sort order can be an easy way to just either brute force that or at least preview it. And then finally, for our size, we're just going to make these some little bitty ones between 5 and 10. And everything else here is good to go. So we're going to be using a sphere location again. And for our sphere, we're just going to make this quite a bit bigger. Like, yeah, we wanted to kind of fill the entire flame area down here since embers could come from anywhere in there. And that's the only thing we need to do there. So we'll jump down to our add velocity, and here we're going to start getting a little bit fancier than our flames were. So where right now we've got it set to linear, we're going to go ahead and set it to from point instead. And you can kind of get some sense of what this is probably doing. Adding velocity from a point just picks a point in space. In this case, it's the origin, and just applies velocity to the particles from there. So hence why they are all running away in a kind of sphere shape right now. So that part's great. We're gonna go ahead and set these to 50 and 75 instead. And the last thing that we want to do in the velocity specifically is down here where there's this origin offset, we just want to set the z-axis to like -40. And what that's doing is it's moving the point that this velocity is being applied from. It's taking it from the origin right about here down a little bit. And so that just means that while you're still going to get some of that more organic motion that the point provides rather than, the very, very direct motion from a linear add, it's still going to be going pretty much in the direction that you want. It's all going to be pushed upwards. And we're going to refine this a little bit more in our particle update before we worry too much about any of the stuff we've got in here right now. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and add a new module called point attraction force. And what this is going to do is it's going to, you see a little bit with the little eyeball preview. This is going to create a space in which any particles caught in here are going to be pulled towards a point in space with whatever strength and radius and stuff like that we give it. So we're going to bump the attraction strength up a little bit, and you can see there how they all kind of start getting pulled back towards a specific point. And we're going to, let's double check our radius right now. I'll isolate this so we have a little more context. We're going to move the position of our point that it's pulling towards up a little bit, kind of the opposite of what's going on in add velocity. So we're going to pull that up to 100 in Z. And then we'll just increase the radius a little bit so that we're catching the bottom of the fire as well. And that should be pretty much good to go on that. So you can unhide this sphere, and you can see this kind of recreates a lot of the same stuff that we wanted out of the feeling of the flames, where with the flames, we were creating this kind of like bowing outward motion and then back up, mostly through the curve of the sprite size and the size of that initial sphere that broadens it out a little bit, randomizes it a little bit. because these particles are so much smaller, we can do that with their actual motion a little bit instead. Or we kind of have to. Now, because these are going a little bit higher than I really want them to, we're going to add another module down here called drag. And this is, the easiest way to think of it is probably just kind of air resistance that you can customize or what have you. But yeah, we don't, I think the initial settings for this actually look pretty good, so we can just leave that at 1, and that just lets us keep all of those nice motions, but also slow the particles down a little bit so they don't go quite so far away. And then the last new module that I want to add to this one is one of one of my favorite ones. I want these to swirl a lot more around the fire itself. And this is something that will work really, really nicely for these embers because they're a little bit smaller. You're going to really be able to see it if we have some sort of nice extra motion like that. So we'll go ahead and go again, adding a new module, and we're going to pull up vortex velocity. Well, first off, let's try setting this a lot higher to start with so we can actually see it. That's maybe not that high. So I think I want to try putting this on a curve, actually, so that we can start it out without really any velocity or any vortex velocity specifically. We can tone that way down from what we did have it at. So we'll do something like 1,000 to start with, and then we can ramp it up to something like 2,500. That obviously gave us a lot at 0.35. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit F while we have the curve highlighted to fit it back on our screen. And I think, look at that, I think that's a pretty solid little bit of motion, like, you compare it to before. It's just a little bit extra magical and fun. I'm going to go ahead and drag and select this bottom key, and again, right click it and set the tangent curve to auto, just to smooth that out a little bit. And I think that's all of our new modules for this one. Like, I'm pretty happy with the motion on this, so we'll just go ahead and make sure that we're happy with everything else. I think the sprite size we can probably simplify a little bit. Go ahead and we're just gonna pull this down to 0. It's okay, I think, if the sprites have a little bit more bounce to them in the embers than the flames, because we don't need them to fill out the base of the fire so much. And just having a little bit more like initial kind of whoop, technical term, having them just have a little bit more of an initial pop is actually kind of nice for this in terms of variation, in terms of how embers often behave in real life, stuff like that. And we'll do the same thing at the end of their lifetime. We'll just scale them back down to 0 and adjust this curve a little bit. I think that's good size-wise. And then in our colors, I just want to go a lot richer where we can. So I think because we're scaling these all the way down to 0, we can actually get rid of these alpha keys. You can just select them and hit the delete key. We'll drag this over here for cleanliness' sake. And that'll let these be brighter for longer. We'll just drag this key over a little bit, this one as well. Actually want to make this orange a little bit more vibrant faster. Something like this. Yeah. And then we're going to try and we're going to go ahead and drag the red over so that those just hit red a little bit faster at the end. So you still get all of that like nice, rich, vibrant color in here. It doesn't stay completely blown out because, I mean, embers tend to have a really, really cool color transition in a lot of cases. So if we can kind of hold on to that and play with that a little bit, then that's kind of a win. Let's try adding one more key towards the end here and see how, if adding any purple in there. Not totally convinced that you can tell, but we'll roll with it. And then last thing on here, just since these are sparks, we want them to have a little bit more energy and chaos than the base flames. We'll just bump our rotation rates from -30 to -60 and so on. And that's everything for our embers. So we're just gonna do one more copy paste on the flame emitter, since it's going to be the more similar of the two. And we're just going to make our smoke real quick. So go ahead and rename this to whoop. And I think our spawn rate for that is actually fine. We're going to, again, we'll isolate this while we're starting out on it again. Want to make them stick around a little bit longer again. And for our color, I actually want to get a little bit more randomized. So I'm going to switch to a random range. And we're just going to do something kind of like dark red, like this. And then we're going to set the alpha pretty low. Something like, maybe not that low. Something like 0.5. Let's go ahead and copy and paste this in here so you can see where this is starting to head. And then for this one, we'll just bump it over to a little bit more orange. A little more red here, a little more purple here, so we can start getting some of that, again, some of that richness and kind of pushing this through a broader palette into something that's almost cooling off by the time we get to the smoke. So, I think like that, and we'll just go ahead and make these a little bit smaller to start with because we want them to, we want them to kind of hide behind the flames initially. And on this one for our sphere location, we're going to make it let's go ahead and isolate it again. We're going to make it a little bit bigger, and we're going to mess with the offset in this one. So in the sphere location, it's hidden by default, unlike the velocity. So we're going to go down to the bottom in transform and go to offset mode and set that to default instead. So that'll give us access to the actual offset coordinates. And we're just going to bump that up to something like 45. Yeah, so so that generally stays behind the flames, but we're going to see a lot more of those now. And for our add velocity, we're again going to switch this over to a point, and then we're going to tone it down real quick. We'll actually tone it down even a little bit more, so 25 to 75. And then for our origin offset, we're again going to push it down a little bit, but I also want to add a little bit of extra motion to this. So we're actually going to offset it on X a little bit so that the smoke is getting pushed by a little bit of, like, you know, wind or something like that. In our sprite size, we're going to go ahead and just get rid of these two, and we can start these at something like 0 since they're starting behind the fire. But the main thing that we're going for here, I'm going to set this last key to 1, is that we want these to get bigger over the course of their lifetime instead of smaller, just because, you know, that's generally how smoke behaves. That's how smoke tends to dissipate. And so just making sure that even though we're doing something really, really stylized with all of our little square fire textures and stuff here, that we're still grounding it in reality where we can. So having the smoke at least kind of like move and dissipate in the right way will give you a lot more believability, even if it's just a little square. And actually that's way smaller than I think I really want. So we'll go ahead and start these at 0.8 and then bump this up to 0.2. We'll go to our color next. And here, the main thing I want to do is the smoke is just really, really thick right now. So we're never actually going to hit full opacity with these. We're going to set our full opacity ones to half opacity instead. And the other thing that I really want to do here is I want to really tie this into the fire a little bit more. So we're going to start this out at like a really, really rich orange like this. And then we'll move our red key. Come on. All the way over here, set that a little bit more orange as well. And then we're going to start moving into kind of those darker grays and stuff that's like, you know, a little bit more traditional smoke color. I'm bending more kind of like purples here very intentionally, because I don't want this to get too gray and desaturated, like just for the particular style of fire that we're doing, where it is very bright, very colorful. Pushing those colors a little bit more is just kind of fun and keeps the whole thing cohesive. I am going to lighten my initial colors up a little bit though, so that that color gradient in the scale color can have a little bit more influence. All right. Brighten these up a little bit more again. And I think that gets us in a pretty good space with the smoke. And then for our rotation rate, again, just to emphasize the fact that we're pushing this in a particular direction from some like really, really gentle wind or something like that with our velocity offset, I'm going to go ahead and make all of these rotate in the same direction. So where before they might rotate counterclockwise, they might rotate clockwise. We're going to go ahead and rotate all of these clockwise. So we'll give it 30 to 90 as our range instead. And if we isolate, you can see a little bit better that now all of them are kind of moving with a little bit more cohesive motion, which is nice here. And then two things that we're going to add real quick. We are going to bring back our hero gravity force from the beginning. Perfect. We're going to switch our gravity vector to a random range again. And we're just going to zero all of these out, except that we are going to commit physics crimes, and we're going to set our minimum and maximum to 50 and 100 instead of negative 980, like Earth intended. So this is just going to pull our smoke up a little bit more and literally defy gravity a little bit. But it's a nice extra little bit of motion in addition to just the base velocity. And just to counter how much that's going up, and give it a little bit of a feeling of air resistance, we're just going to bring in another drag module. We're going to leave this one at the default as well, because we don't want to keep this like super hugged into the fire. We just want it to not be going quite so far off. So we're gonna call that good as well, actually. So one last thing before we call this done. I just wanted to revisit our flames based on what we've talked about in the embers, because there are a couple bits of motion from the embers that I think the flames could actually benefit from. So we'll go ahead and isolate our flames real quick. The first thing I want to do is I do want to actually switch our linear velocity here to a point velocity. And then we'll just bring back our same velocities as before. So 50 and 75, and we'll offset this a tiny bit with negative 10. And you can see how like having a much smaller number there, or a much smaller offset there, is pushing these out into at least part of that sphere still. So to make sure that we're still kind of maintaining that overall torch or campfire shape, I am going to go ahead and steal our point attraction force from over here. So Control C, and then we'll just Control V over here. And then we're just gonna, let's try randomizing our attraction strength a little bit. So randomizing this will do 0 to 20. This will let some flames kind of get away every once in a while, you can see, which is something fires do a lot. They're very chaotic and organic, but it'll still mostly maintain that shape, which is really nice. And then we're going to go ahead and move this one down a little bit, just so we're not dragging them too far up. And we'll just reduce our attraction radius by about half to complement that. So even with those couple little changes, you can see that it really starts to take on a little bit more of a like very organic, natural fire shape where stuff escapes every once in a while, but you're still mostly maintaining that shape, and it's still, you know, complementing the embers and the smoke and stuff like that really well. So that's our fire. Hopefully this was fun. Hopefully this is something that, like, if you want to play around with it and try making a bunch of different fires, or just playing around with colors, playing around with making different types of looping effects like this, hopefully this gets you kind of feeling ready and excited to do more of that. We are going to be digging into a lot of the different modules and some of the nuances of, like, how to customize them, how to really take advantage of how powerful Niagara can be in the next tutorial. But hopefully this was fun, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one. All right. Cheers, y'all.